So tonight I want to talk about multiculturalism as a majority Anglo strategy. But before starting, let me state the acknowledgement of nation. I acknowledge Australia's historic Anglo nation, forged by explorers and pioneers from the British Isles and other European lands. I acknowledge Australia's first peoples, the Aborigines and Torres Strait Islanders, and I acknowledge the Commonwealth, created to preserve the nation and protect the freedom of all citizens. Okay, why would a country's majority bother playing multicultural politics? That's what tonight's talk is about. After all, multiculturalism is defensive. As policy, it has the hallmarks of weakness, not of strength of the majority. Consider multiculturalism in Australia. The ideology and practice developed from a relationship between minorities, typically migrant minorities, and the powerful left intelligentsia based in the universities, mainstream media, and elsewhere. The minorities were the clients of the left. They were not powerful people. They were the clients of the left. It was something of a protection racket. The left were cosmopolitans who felt little or no ethnic or religious loyalties. Paradoxically, they provided cover for minority tribalists of one sort or another. The Anglo left sought to transform society in a Marxist direction and used minority ethnocentrism as a battering ram against conservative Anglo society. That was their goal. Minorities had their own. The multicultural formula is condescending towards minorities because Anglo radicals are anything but tribal. They hold their own tribe in contempt, for example, yet they encourage minorities and only minorities to do such things as take pride in their ethnic identities and in the culture of their ethnic homelands. As explained in New South Wales legislation passed as recently as 2000, this is extraordinary words, quote, "The people of New South Wales are of different linguistic, religious, racial, and ethnic backgrounds, who, either individually or in community with other members of their respective groups, are free to profess, practice, and maintain their own linguistic, religious, racial, and ethnic heritage," unquote. The cosmopolitan left also encouraged minorities to criticize and, if possible, to outlaw through legislation, defamation of minority groups by the Anglo majority. They encouraged them to vote for and lobby for politicians and policies friendly to minorities. In particular, they encouraged them to lobby for pro-minority immigration and education policies. And finally, the cosmopolitan left, the Anglo left, urged minorities to vote and lobby against politicians and policies friendly to the majority ethnic group. So this multiculturalism is a strange combination of anti-tribalists, post-ethnic individuals encouraging tribalism in minorities. But it's all defensive, even in its aggression. It's the policy of vulnerable, insecure groups. Western majorities, on the other hand, have not felt it necessary to protect themselves in this way. Of course, they have been free to profess, practice, and maintain their identities. Who would stop them from doing so? And being in the European tradition of outmarriage, they absorbed minorities over time. So why would a dominant ethnicity, such as Anglo-Australians, adopt such a defensive stance? Why not simply elect a majority to Parliament and pass legislation at will to protect the majority's interests? In effect, that is what majorities have always done. They have exercised the force of their numbers, their sheer force of numbers, to repel invaders and set society on the desired track, so their children and grandchildren are not enslaved to invaders and instead live in a friendly, supportive society. That's what it means to have a country. That has been the strategic thinking of Australian nationalists since the gold rush days, mid-19th century, when ethnic diversity first became a serious threat. But the reality is that around the West, especially in the Anglosphere, the founding Anglo ethnicity has been defeated, subordinated, and in effect has lost control of the state apparatus that it created. These ethnic groups, these Western ethnic groups, have been culturally and politically disarmed. Explaining how that happened is a long story in its own right, which I'll just touch on now. A leading cause has been the suppression of overt expressions of Anglo identity by the education system and the mainstream media. One tactic used has been to assassinate reputations. Because Anglophobes have possessed assets within the corporate mass media, they've been able to target dissident leaders and systematically destroy their standing. It's called political correctness. You might have heard the term. Of course, Anglo identity has continued, but more implicitly than explicitly. It's not something openly talked about in polite society, Anglo identity. The overall effect of suppressing Anglo identity has been to keep it implicit in public discourse, while minority identity is often explicit. This has led to a vast asymmetry in power relations. For explicit identity allows the engagement of conscious strategizing with all the cultural and organizational capacities that go with it. Implicit identity does have effects, but they are short range, imprecise, and episodic. Implicit identity does not engage the conscious mind. Examples illustrate the power differential that results. An obvious result of explicit ethnicity is defence agencies and block voting. In Australia, Anglos have had only one such organisation, British Australian Community, while immigrants and Indigenous bodies are numerous. The Anglo vote is split among the various political parties. Anglo's implicit identity does have effects such as choice of schools and suburbs. Bill Bishop's 2009 book, The Big Sort, explains that in the United States, that country is now as segregated today as it was at the height of official segregation in the early 20th century. Now, segregation is not imposed, but it's due to free choice, most notably white flight, though all ethnic groups seek out their own kind. During the 1990s, white flight took the form of whites changing cities, not so much moving from city to suburb. 40% of Americans' 320 metropolitan areas lost white population. Blacks moved to cities that had large black populations. So there was a self-segregation taking place that is still with us today, and is also found in large Australian cities. Large Australian cities are patch quilts of ethnic concentrations. Compare white flight, a phenomenon driven by implicit ethnic assessments, to the powerful ethnic organizations that represent minorities. In the United States, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, La Raza, which represents Mexican Americans, and the Anti-Defamation League in the United States and their equivalents in Australia have budgets in the millions of dollars. They have full-time professional staff, are respected and platformed, not deplatformed, but platformed by the media, political parties, and universities. These organizations pursue policies explicitly formulated to advance their people's and the left's interests via immigration, employment, and education. They condemn and seek to destroy any Anglos whose ethnic identity approaches the explicitness of their own. pro-white organisations are not tolerated. As a result of this assault, Anglos have been relegated to statelessness, as Professor Andrew Fraser, a BAC member, puts it. We are a stateless people, actually, not in the sense of having our passports confiscated, but in the sense of not enjoying the ethnic protections which were among the reasons our ancestors created the state apparatuses of the New World, Australia, America, Canada, and New Zealand. We have been subordinated in an ethnic hierarchy legitimated by the ideology of multiculturalism. Yet we still pay taxes and sustain the state, despite being the lowest ranking ethnic group. That arguably is slavery, according to the American revolutionaries who rebelled in 1776 because they refused to pay taxes without representation. That was the great slogan of the American Revolution. Their inspiration was the great English philosopher John Locke, the father of liberalism, who in the 17th century distinguished two types of slavery, both of which may apply to Anglos today. The first type is legitimate slavery, that is, forced labour imposed by the just victor of a war. Arguably, we have been conquered since the 1950s in a cultural war, though it is difficult to see how this victory or our enslavement was just. Locke's second type of slavery he called illegitimate, the authoritarian deprivation of unalienable rights. This seems to be a better fit with our present reality. According to another English philosopher, a great one, Thomas Hobbes, slavery was a brutal fact of the state of nature. Hobbes argued that slaves owe the state nothing. They have no obligations to their masters and may legitimately rebel against them. Slaves may treat their masters as renegades, illegitimate tyrants. Perhaps a new Boston Tea Party is called for down under, who knows? A growing list of commentators date Anglo subordination to the post-World War II period and link the takeover to the loss of great public institutions by the left ideologues. I'll just mention some of these analysts who have been writing for some time. E. Digby Baltzell's famous 1964 book, The Protestant Establishment, brought up this issue. He said Anglos are being competed with for elite position. Robert C. Christopher in 1989 wrote a book called Crashing the Gates, the de-wasping of America's power elite. So by 1989, it was advanced, the process. Richard Brookhiser in 1991 wrote The Way of the Wasp. Eric Kaufman in 2004 wrote The Rise and Fall of Anglo-America. Kaufman argued that since the 1950s, the cultural elite in the United States has been mopping up white resistance. There's been a mopping up operation. Basically, the strategic battle was won in 1950, by 1950s. More recently, Victor Davis Hanson, a fellow at the Hoover Institution in California, has compared the present cultural revolution to that of the 1960s. There's a bit of a long quote. Quote, "This time around, the revolutionaries are the establishment. They run the corporate boardrooms, as we saw with Coca-Cola, Disney, and Delta Airlines. They run Silicon Valley. They can block the President of the United States from expressing an idea. They don't do that with the bloodthirsty leaders of Hamas or Iran, but they do it with an ex-president. They can control the way we communicate. They control the way we search on Google. They monopolize professional sports. They have a monolithic message that all athletes parrot every time they suit up for a game. They control the content of television and movies and even commercials. They control Wall Street. And I think everybody on Wall Street realizes that you have to be pretty liberal and you have to mouth certain platitudes. and foundations. Most of the great foundations in the United States, in terms of endowment, are left-wing. These are the revolutionaries now. So the establishment has become revolutionary, overthrowing what? White America. And most recently of all, Douglas Murray, a British commentator, has written a book, The War on the West. And he also notes that left liberals control all public institutions. We are a defeated people, precisely because since the 1950s, the traditional nation-state strategy has failed us. That strategy, evolved over centuries, was for the nation, defined at its core by the founding ethnic group, to be protected by the great public institutions comprising the state. That alignment of state and nation had changed by the 1950s because the commanding heights of culture and politics had been captured by people who don't identify with us and don't like us very much. Now we are in a position to answer the question that opened this discussion. Why would the ethnic majority adopt multiculturalism, the tactic of the left and of minorities? The answer begins with the realization that by the 1950s, as I've been explaining, the majority had lost control of cultural production and distribution, and thus of the ability to promulgate narratives that legitimate national interests. Cultural elites, hostile to Anglo interests, had taken charge. Because the cosmopolitan left controlled the universities, the mainstream media, and the education system, people felt confused or ashamed about identity issues. Many did not know their own tribal identity, or if they did know, were terrified of being labelled racists, bigots, nativists, conservatives, extremists, white supremacists, haters, conspiracy theorists, social Darwinists, etc., etc. Like Eskimos' large vocabulary for types of snow, the West's political elites have devised and inculcated many ways to denigrate Anglo identity and ethnocentrism. Eric Kaufmann, a political scientist based in London, points out in his book White Shift, published last year, that this is unfair because in multicultural politics, it is not only normal but appropriate for individuals to be conscious of their ethnic or cultural identities and active in defending them. One sure sign of our subordinate status is that only white majorities are punished for expressing ethnic identity and preferences. Anglos' weakness, their vulnerability and trained psychological fragility, suggests that one compelling reason to adopt a multicultural strategy is caution. Protection is one reason for majority identitarians to adopt multiculturalism. An analogy is tax law. Individuals and small companies are advised to adopt tax minimization methods that are being used by large corporations. The latter have the advantage of sophisticated legal advice and lobbying power to win favor with government. Small business entities can share these privileges by huddling in the shadows of giants. In that case, to prosecute the small fry requires the authorities to go after the large corporations, which is a more difficult task. Likewise, as we see in official statements of multicultural rights, these include the right to profess, practice, and maintain ethnic and racial heritage. If official mainstream multiculturalism is permitted to profess, practice, and maintain their tribes, we stand a better chance of openly caring about our tribes, our tribe, Anglo-Australia. That would make multiculturalism democratic for the first time. It would also provide a shield and a spear to defend against Anglophobic attacks. Anglophobia is a big problem. As Harry Richardson and I have documented, for decades, there has been a rising cannonade of hateful lies that has poisoned the culture that awaits our children. Anglophobia is growing more intense at the same time that Anglo numbers are falling towards minority status. We need to be using multicultural tactics to defend against vilification, to preserve a dignified, respectful environment for future generations. We cannot expect much support from the left, but it should be sufficient to appeal to the Australian sense of fair play. Whatever allies are found, whether in business, among churches or government, at the local, state or federal level, the fight against Anglophobia must not be handed over as a whole. We made that mistake before. Love cannot be outsourced. Anglos must maintain citadels, social networks, and structures of uncompromised affiliation, sanctuaries where we can be true to ourselves, citadels that act as secure wellsprings of identity and self-interested action. I have a recurring dream about how democratic multiculturalism might work, and I'll share that dream with you. The dream goes as follows. I imagine a multicultural conclave convened by a state or federal government to tap the views of Australia's ethnic communities. These things happen, by the way, sort of regularly. Multicultural gatherings. These gatherings are diverse, but more so on this occasion, in my dream, because Anglo-Australians are represented for the first time. Not by a white person who advocates for Aboriginal land rights, not by a white person who advocates for the corporate sector, and not by a white person who argues that it is a moral imperative to keep immigration race blind. No, that would be normal Anglophobic multiculturalism. What is causing some murmuring among the assembled is that this white person openly advocates for Anglo-Australia. Those assembled cannot put their finger on what is wrong with this, because this Johnny-come-lately is doing nothing different in principle to what they have been doing for decades, namely putting their own communities first. They just know he is somehow racist, though to call him that would open them to the same charge if the media were at all even-handed. Anyway, the dream continues. Proceedings commence. The presiding politician opens with a speech in which he praises Australia as the most successful multicultural society in the world, because diversity is rising rapidly, and the campaign against racism in the media and schools has banished almost all complaints. So it's working very well. Thank you. He concludes by asking those assembled to express their view of how multiculturalism is progressing now that immigration is set to return to high levels following the pause caused by the pandemic. The first community leader to speak claims to represent Chinese Australians. She explains that her community is feeling cut off due to the hiatus and points out how Australia will benefit from rising business activity and school results if Chinese are accepted in large numbers once again. She praises the Race Discrimination Act, and especially Section 18C, which has helped her community defend against racist abuse. Next comes the representatives of the Arab, Indian, Vietnamese, Greek, Lebanese, Ukrainian, Indonesian, Melanesian, African, Sri Lankan, Malaysian, Turkish, and Philippine communities, not to mention a few. They all praise the runaway success of Australia's multiculturalism, including the growth of their particular communities, and urge its continued expansion via non-discriminatory immigration and funding of the Human Rights Commission. One speaker makes a joke about how multiculturalism is ending Australia's stereotype as a stale and pale country. Then the representative of the Anglo community speaks. He sympathises with the views already expressed, though not the implicit Anglophobia. He understands that ethnic communities want continued access to and from their homelands, and want and want to see their critics silenced. Of course they do. He understands that. It is precisely because he empathizes with these aspirations that he wants the same benefits for Anglo-Australians. He wants the Anglo share of the population to grow and thinks that would be the best outcome for Australia as a whole because it would secure social cohesion by limiting diversity. He also thinks that the country's population should be kept small in this fragile, dry continent. And although his people are sick and tired of anti-white racism, they also want to be free of Orwellian legislation such as the Racial Discrimination Act and its Section 18C. If multiculturalism is to be a plus for Australia, he says, it must be built on democratic foundations, not on the oppression and replacement of the founding nation. That is a pleasant dream. How might it be made reality? At the risk of committing a cliche from the 1960s, I think the key is to raise consciousness. We need to teach our people about the distinction between nation and state. Those two concepts need to become symbolically separated. Our people need to understand that the Commonwealth, the federal state apparatus created by our people at the end of the 19th century, is not the nation. The Commonwealth is not the nation. The nation is a self-aware ethnic community living in its homeland that awakened in the late 19th century. Teaching this lesson might be difficult because the founding ethnic group, that's us, has been intertwined with the state and its symbols for centuries, if we go back to our European origins. The nation needs to be positioned in relation to some prominent institutions, including by positioned, I mean, in people's minds, needs to be positioned in relation to prominent institutions such as Parliament, the bureaucracy, the monarchy, the Constitution, and the mainstream churches. That challenge is eased by the fact that opposition or even criticism is not the point of the distinction. Instead, the point is to separate in people's minds the nation from these institutions and their symbols. One tactic will be to talk about Anglo identity in polite society. We have to start doing that. The contrary taboo must be broken. Another tactic might be to assert ownership over those institutions. After all, our ancestors created them. And what is possessed is separate in principle from the owner. Another strategy is to build private institutions that provide sanctuaries for identity and association, and others, perhaps the same bodies, which act as citadels to defend our community in the media, education, welfare, and business sectors. Doing so will necessitate replacing elites co-opted by the state and hostile actors. Raising ethnic consciousness will allow Anglos to recreate and elevate their own passionate elite. In effect, we need to re-tribalize to some degree. How could such a multicultural strategy succeed? Well, just a few points on feasibility. We are experiencing a period of massive reaction across the West. This is to be expected given the unnaturalness of the globalist and anti-majority ideologies. Stripping peoples of their traditional identities runs the risk of backlash. The alien and unhealthy behavior of many protagonists is increasingly manifest. The collapse of rationality in the universities and in public discourse is generating repulsive and destructive doctrines such as gender fluidity and anti-whiteness. Overreach of hostile elites, as is happening now, trying to crush white resistance instead of waiting for demographic swamping to take effect. It's most unwise. Finally, there is morality. The dispossession of the majority has always been illegitimate. For example, criminals were prime movers of early multiculturalism, such as Al Grasby and Lionel Murphy. More fundamentally, even if the multicultural vanguard had consisted solely of honest, useful idiots, the process has been undemocratic. There's not been one election called to decide these fundamental ethnic issues, such as immigration, multiculturalism. The antagonistic elites were citizens, not open enemies. They lacked the right to conduct tribal cultural warfare. Politics is meant to put aside the standards of warfare. What is being practiced by Anglophobic multiculturalism is eliminationist cultural warfare. It's not on. This evidence of immorality will surely heighten Anglo awareness of the outrages committed against their people. If Anglos succeed in implementing democratic multiculturalism, what will the result look like? The strategy is what might be called neo-patriotism, motivated by the ancient love of people and country, but also informed by science and philosophical rigor. Neo-patriotism looks to the interests of the founding ethnicity. It is determined to find a way back to cohesion and belonging, despite the diversity inflicted on society over the last half-century by renegade elites. As the leading culture, Anglo-patriotism should not abandon citizens, whatever their backgrounds, of course. They might be the instruments of Anglophobes, but they are innocent and their individual rights must be respected. At the same time, the Anglo community should look to its own vital interests of continuity and sovereignty. The existential reality is that Anglo-Australians' fate is bound to that of the country as a whole. It may not always be true that what benefits the nation's core identity also benefits the Commonwealth. But it is certainly true that what hurts Australia wounds its founding people. Therefore, the policies of democratic multiculturalism can be expected to converge on traditional patriotic values. Anglo advocates will know their fight is won, or at least going in a winning direction, when assimilation is once again winning over ethnocultural diversity as a guiding principle for choosing immigrants. In particular, when the refugee intake is cut and the migrant intake is greatly reduced and limited mainly to people of European descent. When the Chinese and Indian nations are no longer colonizing Australia and relations with these rising powers consist of mutual respect. When our cultural elites reverse their Anglophobia and begin to like and respect our history. Wouldn't that be a change? When schools desist from radical indoctrination and teach children the glorious history of their nation and civilization. When our sons and daughters are not pitted against each other in a fabricated gender war. When civil liberties are secured largely by keeping the state out of the private realm. When UN mandates are lifted to restore freedom of speech and association, allowing citizens to choose what they say and among whom they live and work. When core institutions are reformed to become more compatible with human nature instead of socially engineering and herding them. When foreign ownership is once again regulated to protect Australian industry and homeowners. When the multicultural apparatus is dismantled as a system designed to oppress the nation and is replaced with a democratic multiculturalism that includes fair representation for Anglo-Australians. In short, when the historic nation throws off its shackles and reasserts its prerogatives. These policies will be enacted only when Anglo-Australians become sufficiently mobilized and organized to vote for their ethnic interests and build lobby organizations so powerful that wise politicians avoid offending their sensibilities or appearing less than eager to preserve national identity. Thanks for your attention.